or something like, I don't even I hold on to those things. That was just a guess, but I know I'm right.
We're gonna go with that. We're gonna go with that. Like, let's not even. So I want to know, speaking on that, like, and Zach, you can start. Like, what do you think makes an iconic sneaker?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you said about iconic being changing the way we think of something, it really resonates with me. For me, what makes like a sneaker iconic, or really any design object iconic, is when it completely kind of redefines its category or redefines your relationship as a viewer to that object. So I think when you design a sneaker, or when you design a book in our case, or a logo, there are certain designs from the past that you just like have to reckon with, that you have to confront and either accept or reject. And when a design has to be reckoned with like that, that's for me when it's really iconic.
Glenn?
Yeah, well, I'm a historian, so I tend to like get in the Wayback Machine when thinking about stuff like this. So when I hear the word icon, I actually think of the Middle Ages. I think of debates that raged. Do you depict Christ or not? Right? You think of the Russian icon, wall of the church. And what's interesting to me is that the sneaker in our culture maybe occupies a role that's not that different from that picture of Christ. Like, it is our religion, and we joke about it. We talk about, the cult of sneakerhead, or the way that people have a kind of reverence or follow the truth of this design world. But there's something real there, like in a secular society like ours, a lot of us are secular, we need something to fill that space that used to be filled by religion. And I think in a lot of cases, that is people like Michael Jordan. It is brands like Nike. Maybe it's designers for some people. And that's like really powerful human stuff. It goes all the way. It's like your foundation, what it was for a person 1,000 years ago. They built their whole lives around their faith in God. And if you don't have that today, and a lot of us don't, what do you put there? And so to me, when you say a sneaker is an icon, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about something that's spiritual, that's emotional, that maybe has to do with celebrity culture, but it also is everything to do with finding your way as a human in the world and what you really care about most deeply.
And V, not to put you on the spot here, but I'm totally going to. What would you say is the most iconic out of the 10?
Definitely on the spot. Like, that's like when a book is a little bit important, a little bit. Imagine me, the kid, right? That was like, I'm going to Nike on the plane. This is the company that I've always wanted to like do something with. I kind of know what the project is. And I was like, I have to suggest something that's just not one and done, right? I could have just been offered to do a colorway of one shoe. And instead I was thinking wider scope, And so basically I offered a treatment that could apply to 10 shoes, which then could be 20 or 60. Cause it's like, I'm not designing the shoe, I'm designing the logic that the shoe goes into. So you put that through the machine, then all of a sudden you can start reinterpreting something that was in their archive. So that was the idea. So to pick out one shoe, it's like it works as a set, and that's why the book is the book. But like, of course, and they're both like the Jordan, because Michael Jordan was my Superman. As Glenn was saying, like, how could you not believe the guy could fly in air? And that's what the advertising, great copywriting, great advertising exalted a guy from Chicago, where I was from, to superhuman heights. But then, like, the Air Force One to me is like an amazing object, like, to me, I would say that that's like, in a way, iconic just the same. I don't know why. Like, I just see like Jim Jones and Cameron, or Dame Dash and Jay-Z, or Nelly, you know, like the point at that which that object relates to Black culture, it's like been adopted as a, you know, tabby boot for the street or something like that, which I love these like canons, you know, I'm all about the different canons or icons, if you refer to it to that. Like the whole idea is to really scribe Black design into putting it on the bookshelf. Like if you look behind Zach, you see that whole bookshelf, and I guarantee you there's like, those are canons. Like they are, like, I like how Zach, you said, like, what if you design a logo for like an airplane, you have to reckon with like the American Airlines logo or something, like, you know, Helvetica, whatever. But you don't have a bookshelf with that many, or the same amount, clearly, like Black designers of a different viewpoint that are looking at our everyday life and experience and translating into objects. So I always say there's like missing books on bookshelves. And it's funny, we're actually having a conversation about a book, but I think of the whole world like that. If you talk about photography, if you talk about fine art, if you talk about sculpture, you know, there's millions of canons, there's millions of icons that come from the establishment, but where are the ones that aren't written, that aren't written in books? You know, like what was happening from Africa, what was happening in South America, what was happening, you know, like you see how it can quickly get to the root of our understanding when, you know, the lens is usually focused on one way. So like the Air Force One has a cultural connotation that supersedes like a Margiela tabby boot in a way. You know, I'm exploring because I want to put books on shelves. I want to do that full circle narrative when of opening a door basically for understanding. And that's why I appreciate Zach and Glenn, like from different viewpoints, we made this book, which now sits on a shelf that can serve a greater purpose than just being a trivial book about sneakers, you know? Right.
I think all of that makes sense. And I think that you touched on a few things that I want to come back to, like specifically like going into how do you do storytelling when the archive is lost? How do you, you know, specifically talking about like from a cultural standpoint. But I'm going to weave back into that, but I want to go into the design, you know, like I want to talk about, especially design within a digital age. And, you know, we've all kind of had to change pace and redirect how we're doing things. And so this is, it's for all of you, but Glenn, I kind of want you to speak on design and digital age. In your essay, you said, and I'm going to read this right now, the design world today is not just discrete products and graphics. It is a world in itself, an indefinitely interconnecting aesthetic layer draped over every experience, object, and space, giving us a signposted route through the vast landscape and, at its best, a whole new way of thinking. Can you talk to us about design in the digital space? And I know, like, at first I was going to ask you, like, over the past 10 years, but, like, you know, can you kind of give some, like, moments recently that you can speak on that kind of talk on, like, where we're at and where we're going?
Yeah, no, I think we're definitely talking about the nowness of the now when you asked that.
Yeah.
And I love, by the way, Virgil, what you just said about the books that are missing on the bookshelves, and then looking there behind Zach and thinking like this book fills one of the thoughts that you might not have even seen was an absence. I think that's a really powerful idea, and it connects to this idea of what design can be in the digital age, because obviously the digital is an infinite space, so there's no edges, there's no boundaries. So how do you approach it as a designer? And that thing that, Virgil, you also said about not designing an object, but designing a logic that produces maybe an infinite series of objects that subscribe to that idea. It's really an idea, a way of doing business that I think of as rooted in conceptual art. So Duchamp, Warhol, that generation in the late 60s especially, who kind of created these intellectual machines that produced artwork. It was a totally different way of understanding authorship. And that's what leads you to this deconstructed, fragmentary, self-commenting, meta kind of incredible hall of mirrors that's book, right? It's a book that talks to itself in all these ways, from all these different vectors and directions, and that creates the richness. And, you know, maybe the last thing I'll say about that is that, of course, that's also the poison of the digital, because when people start just bouncing off one another and repeating each other's terrible ideas or lies or fakeness, then it feeds on itself as a monster. I've seen so many examples of that. I mean, talk about recent news, right? I don't need to explain that. But it also has this deep human, as I was saying earlier, kind of spiritual, psychologically rich side you get when it's artistically understood in that way, because again, the energy feeds on itself and it becomes so intense and internally complex in a way that I would argue actually conceptual art pre-digitally couldn't, because it didn't have that space, that mental space, as well as the technological space to feed on. So that to me is like that's the ball of confusion that we are in right now. That is turning that sometimes vicious energy to good, and that to me is like why we're all here, you know, to see that can be done.
Great. Well said.
Yeah. Very well said. Thank you. And I think Virgil, you kind of touched on this, but I think Zach, I'd like to hear from you, like why put out a book now, like during the digital time? Like why not do you know, a digital zine that you can upload to your computer? Like why actually make a physical object?
Yeah, and I think also like why now? Because 2020 was the year that like our lives completely moved online. But you know, for those who talk about like the death of print or the death of the book, 2020 really should have been like the nail in its coffin. But I think we realized that exactly the opposite happened. You know, we remembered that not everything is online. That physical objects still have an incredible power, well-crafted objects, you know, and books are just that, I think. I think also for like my generation that grew up in the early days of the internet, books and also magazines, we should include in this conversation, were like the primary forms of knowledge and getting information. And books were really kind of important to my own journey as a designer. I started out studying art history, and it was through books that books became my kind of gateway to other disciplines, architecture, design, culture. And, you know, at a certain point, I realized that, you know, someone must have designed these things, and that person was a graphic designer. Using other people's words and images. So that kind of, and yeah, that's why I think it's still important to be producing books now.
And it's also, I guess, it kind of leads me to this idea about reference, right? Like you're talking about seeing things and being able to reference it. And Virgil, you know, I know what that word means to you.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that the first thing I noticed in the book is that the whole thing can be used as a reference. There is like the second half of the book is a lexicon, right? And I was like, oh, this is great. Like this isn't just like a book about sneakers. This is really like an entryway into sneaker culture. It's a really sweet look into what goes into all of the things. And I think that the lexicon really helps with that, because there's terms in there I think that people throw around all the time and you assume that everybody knows what it is or where that reference comes from. And you guys really put that in there. Like you put like stash, like, I don't know, like, you know, there's a group of us who know who stash is, but like how many really actually know and understand what like Nort was to downtown, or like, you know, any of those bits, you know? So I would love to hear both from you, Virgil, and Zach about why you chose to put the lexicon in, and then also Zach, why the color and weight change of the paper? Sorry,
Yeah.
it's a nerdy question, but it's one that I wanted to know.
Let's get nerdy.
It's perfect because, like I said, like the example of like, oh, am I taking a flight just to design a new Air Force One, or am I on the flight thinking of a logic that speaks to my generation? You know, it's always the latter for me, but it always has to exist as like an understandable quotient, right? So I talk a lot about like the tourist and the purist. It's like the shorthand phrase to understand my point of view. It's not one or the other, it's both. And it's making a space where those two can interact, right? Because a purist knows everything. They can tell you about the first Nike shoe, they've read Shoe Dog, they know in China that made the Jordan versus the Jordan 1 versus the Jordan 2. But then you have the tourist who's like, show me the Supreme Dunks, you know, show me the Dunk or show me the Air Force One. And both of them are valid. That space that they both occupy makes the culture, right? Because you have the purist sort of trying to sort of preach that they know the original, and then you have the tourist who's engaged. They want, you know, like they go to Paris, they want to see the Eiffel Tower. They're not too cool. So my career, and it's my practice really, is to do, I do that at Louis Vuitton, I do it with Off-White, I do it with Nike, and I do it with Mercedes. It proves this theory that to be contemporary in my mind, right, that if you focus on the space at which those interact, then you're sort of making sort of like cultural energy that can exist in its further form, right? Obviously, like Duchamp says the urinal is a fountain. That unlocks something in a million artists' brains. It gives a million artists license to do things that perceivably otherwise were thought like, this isn't that, or this is this. And so to do that, in my sense, my practice is always the same. Like, it's always discovery, making, and then leaving the blueprints of what the logic was to do it, and then continuing on. It doesn't exist without the lexicon in a way, because otherwise there's no evidence, there's no artifact that my investigation was had any depth to it, or it like was just figurative. And that's why, just to round it out, that's why I reject the word streetwear. And I, you know, like 2019, I said it was dead. Like, I don't really mean it was dead, but it was the only way to fit in a fragment that you can't reduce streetwear as to like making bootleg shoes or just switching the swoosh or putting a new colorway on something else. Like, of course it is that, but look at the way Lower East Side New York street culture was built, or Bape in Japan, like Supreme Year 3, taking a New York Yankees logo and flipping it upside down. Of course it's easy, and of course it can just be deemed as like not designed from like a European canon, but it's important. And again, you can see like my tourist and purist, I'm trying to bottle up all that logic into the output. Right. But Zach, you know, I just like take these lots, and then it all ends up on Zach's plate, and he has to make you know that.
I mean,
right.
I think what I love about the lexicon is that another thing Duchamp said is that the artwork is completed by the viewer, and the lexicon really provides the keys to understanding and maybe completing those objects. And I think the idea of the lexicon also connects to how Virgil has accompanied his Louis Vuitton shows with show notes that have a glossary of terms. And that really makes the argument, I think, that words matter. And this book is really about education, I think, and making ideas accessible. So like in terms of design, when all of those ideas from Virgil landed on our plate, there were a few references that we had, icons maybe, and one of those was the exhibition catalog of an international iconic show called Documenta 5, which was in '72. And that show's catalog was this like giant orange 3-ring binder that was like a dictionary that contained all of the artists alphabetized and was the kind of encyclopedia of the 20th century. So when we were working on the design, we always had this kind of in mind and felt that icon should somehow be the documenta of sneakers.
Can I just throw in a quick thing too about this idea of creator and making this referential world at the same time? So I think that's quite rare in art history. Duchamp is definitely one, which is why we quote him all the time. Warhol is one. Donald Judd, who you mentioned, is one. I think Virgil, you were one. But
Yeah.
it's almost like, is that like asking somebody to be 100-yard sprint? Thinking, that sort of creative rush and the speed on the one hand, and this very patient, almost scholarly, analytical quality, so that I see a real lineage there. This kind of capability of self-analysis that then becomes the fuel that provides the speed in the practice. Very unusual.
Yeah.
And V, you talk a lot about, like, there's a bit within the book, I think it's like taken from a show you did a little while ago. And you were talking about sneakers as sculpture. You know, I think we're comparing a lot of this idea of like sneakers as fine art, sneakers as art, sneaker object as art. And so I guess I wanted to know, do you think that the sneaker is an entryway into fine art world? Would you be like, yeah, nah?
What's fun, like, you know, if you ask me that question in 6 hours, I'd have a different answer. But what's inspired by the conversation, like as you were saying that, like me, who's like, you know, all about the interdisciplinary and like there's no boundaries. I also love the boundaries. You know, it's because I've gone over the edge, right? I don't like it just when you phrased it that way, like sneaker. I believe sneaker can as a sculpture, but saying sneaker culture is art. It's kind of like it's why I don't know yet is that there's missing books on the bookshelves to get there. I think this icon book does one, but I'm more to be like skip. Like, who cares? I was just about to swear, so I'm like editing myself. But skip art with a capital A. Of today, but I think it exists in its own space without having to adopt to the larger canon. Like, the canon might not be fully identifying all, so then it sounds funny when you put things into that place when it's maybe like ready-made objects that have a cultural weight
Mm-hmm.
occupies the same gravity that we talk about the Guggenheim, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just hasn't been made. If there's a missing book, then there's a missing institution. So if I make a gallery, which I might do, if I make an institute in New York and I put it on the Upper East Side and it's got every Jordan, it's got every Gucci Man mixtape from the Cold War era or whatever, all of a sudden it belongs in that place. And maybe it doesn't necessarily have to be called art, but I think it's as valuable.
Right.
It's like,
and especially when like you've even got the price tag of certain shoes as the same price tag that you would fetch for a painting. Right.
Yeah. Like there's all sorts of, and that's why I like to zoom out. Like, and I like what Glenn talked about. Like, it's just humanity on Earth crafting different things of value, and it all comes from a history. Even if you don't know the history, it's informing your decision. It's like, you know, religion. These are things that are passed down from way. That's the only dangerous thing about the internet is you could think that what you've learned, even from grade school to high school, and what you've observed, who you follow on Instagram, could give you this false sense of humanity's been on Earth doing this a long time. Bottled water is like my favorite example. You know, like take something, just put it in a package, label it, and it's now worth something when it's flowing from a faucet, you know, 5 feet away. And it's not to talk about what's right or wrong. If you just zoom out and just look at how humanity gravitates towards these things, it's a painting, it's a shoe, it's a book. I feel like we can find out more about ourselves than we can, like, you know, dive into commercialism, capital, whatever. And that's why I love this practice. It's like, we're not just talking about art in capital A as like something fancy in museums or something that rich people have. There says something about us. And previously to making this book, or you know, to sneaker culture, you could see I was grappling with like, where do I fit? Am I just a consumer? You know, can I write a narrative where other people can fit into this narrative of,
right.
And that's where the whole lexicon, in a way, figuratively, is like, you can make the Jordan 1 yourself. You know, I found a kid on Instagram that made one off of a pair that he just bought. You know, that was the logic. That was the aha moment. Like, you can literally make these shoes. And if it sparks in some kid who gets this book, reads it, and is like, oh, Virgil's trash, I'm going to make my own logic built on that. But this was like a essential book to start, you know, their own practice. Then it's the success to me. And so it just so happened the same week we dropped the book, a friend of mine on my team sent me like the Jordan. I'll find it while we're talking, but you know, like that, then it sort of clicks for me.
Right. I'm gonna bounce back to one of my favorite things to talk about, which is archiving and storytelling. So, you know, I've been a photographer for, you know, a very long time. And, you know, so I have over 20 or 30 years worth of negatives that are in my studio that, you know, archiving is like the bane of my existence, you know, but it's also super, super important. I think once, Virgil, you texted me something about like why archiving, or, you know, like make sure that my work is where it needs to be, because, you know, 20 years from now, some kid's going to grab that book off the shelf and understand that, you know, I, as a Black woman, was here, that these things were being documented and they're here. And so I really want to talk to all of you about archiving and the importance of it. And, you know, I'm going to start with you, Glenn, because I think that, like, I always look at my personal work as looking back to move forward, to make like the images that you see all the time. I'm digging back. I'm going into like what my mom did on like in the 60s on you know, 12th Street and Avenue A. I'm going back into what my grandmother did, you know, because that is all me. So I want to know from you, Glenn, is there something that you learned while you were at the V&A about archiving and preserving cultural moments through archiving that you can talk about now that pertain to this whole conversation that we're in?
Yeah, sure. So just to explain the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum, is the biggest museum of art and design in London, biggest design museum in the world, really. So I was the head of research there, working a lot with the archives. I mean, just for one example, when I was there, we were making the David Bowie show that then traveled to a lot of places, including and a situation where Bowie handed over his archive and said, go for it. You know, there was no direction, no very little involvement or authorship from him in that project. And that it's a good example because to me, an archive is in a way the ultimate act of generosity. Is the whole point of an archive is that it's actually not a story. It's a place you can go to get a story, right? Because an archive has this openness and a kind of unstructured, unforced quality that allows other people to come in later on and draw out of it their own threads and then take those threads and weave them into a new fabric. So that to me is why they're so magical and why you can get lost in them and you also in them at the same time. As a historian, of course, a lot of my best moments have been in archives, just sitting totally by myself, finding something that means a huge amount to me. And then I have to go and explain why it isn't significant through writing about it. But it's just an incredible gift to give the future. And just to tie it back into the book, I think one thing that's fantastic about the book, and very, again, unusual, is that it functions as its own archive, which is hard to do because obviously it's difficult to tell a story and got to give the backstory at the same time. But it's kind of like the sneakers that Virgil is actually making. They're both new objects in the world, and they also do that thing of exposing the traces and the sources and the roots of the object at the same time. So it's got this kind of it's like a double transmission, where it's both a new tale to tell, and it's also giving you all those footnotes and that sort of substructure of history and reference. And the book is like that too. So it's like a book both a sneakerhead and a historian can love.
And V, I wanted to ask you, if you can describe to all the people listening right now, your process of archiving, and so is it everything? Is it just with paper? Is it, I know in the book there were WhatsApp conversations clearly, that you put into there, and that's definitely a part of the archive, those thoughts, those little thoughts you'll jab off to someone, but those thoughts then become a shoe, when you're like, I don't like that, change that, quit. So if you don't mind talking about your archival process and how that works for you.
Yeah, it's something I had to learn, right? I went to architecture school, art history. And again, when I was young, the word artist was something that was past a diploma or something like that. Just culturally, you can say it's it's like some other office that you have to go to get that sort of that stamp. And what you don't realize when you're young, or I didn't, is that your gravity comes through what you make, even though you might spend 10, 20 years making stuff that you don't think is as good as what you idolize. But that's your thumbprint. That's your human receipt through life. And then that is what your practice sits on top of. It doesn't sit on top of a future idea that you have to think of as great. So I've always been a bit of I always think that this is important. I'm forever stuck at this 17-year-old version of myself when skateboarding and graffiti and hip hop and magazine, I knew I was getting charged up by that time. So, that put me in the mind frame to make Pyrex and to make my brands and make my bigger outputs. I was always referring back to this sort of golden era. And my archive is super important to me. Just to directly answer your question, my bill for storage units is insane. And they're all over the world, filled with because I know that it's important to my story. And I'll tell you, the reason why is a bit unique is that once I've studied the great icons before me, I realized that their story is told through their archive, or their story is told through the process, not just the end result. So I know that's I just want young people to think and take the beginnings phases of their work seriously, because those investigations, if you have to archive it and you have to be accessible at some point, or maybe never, but at some point someone should be able to go back and see the depth.
Mm-hmm.
And so do you think that icons, the archiving work that you put into icons, that will inspire future generations of ...
Yeah, that was the point. Zach can speak to it. I think it literally, that's why the book is printed. I wouldn't do trust me, I go to Barnes and Noble or whatever bookstore at the airport, and if I see a sneaker book, no diss, but I can tell by the cover that it's it might be too first rate for me, to dig into it or something. I appreciate it.
Right.
But
so you skip right past it.
Yeah, I'll go for like a architectural digest even or something like that. Or wallpaper, like whatever's at the museum, like on the airport gift shop type vibe. But I'm proud of what we made. It's because we set the needle as far as what we're into, as far as the icons.
Yeah.
Zach,
I think
Zach,
to add to what Glenn and Virgil said, I mean, I also think that archives are a way of, it's not necessarily about nostalgia for me and nostalgia for the past, but it's about ways to take ideas of the past to think about the future and to kind of like a creative engine, I guess. And I think that that's something that is really highlighted in some of the decisions and choices we made with this book in particular. I mean, just like starting with the cover, the swoosh that is used on the cover is from the Nike archive. It's the original 1971 swoosh by Carolyn Davidson. And, it looks very different from the swoosh that we're most familiar with. And I think that choice was made specifically to say that like this is also about design history. So there are a few moves. Also, the WhatsApp messages that you mentioned, Shaniqua, there are a series of pages in the book, black and white pages that include messages between Virgil and the design team and, iPhone photographs. And I think, that's a form of archiving. And we asked at the start of the book, everyone that was involved in this project to scrape their WhatsApp group chats for all different kinds of information and insights into this creative process. So I think archives can also be, things that we don't typically expect them to be. Yeah, I would say that's kind of the importance of archiving also with respect to this book.
And so my next question is about inspiration. I know that I feel like all of us before COVID were really out there traveling and gathering our inspiration from different places, different times, different things. I wanted to talk to you guys about how you're finding inspiration now, and specifically in that everyone's lifestyle had to change, and the way that you grab things. And I was saying earlier, watching YouTube of Tatiana Bilbao's, like why she decided to do what she does in Mexico City and abroad, like that's like where I'm finding inspiration, like something that's completely different from my practice. I'm like, oh, let me get into that. And let me get into, people who are thinking about doing things in a different way, culturally, figuratively, literally. Like I just want to expand in a different way if I'm stuck in my daybed here. So I would love to know from all of you during these very historic times how you are finding your inspiration.
Glenn, you could go first.
Yeah, I mean, it's an easy answer because it's sort of like happening right now, what we're doing right now. There, the way that the world has opened up for me in the last year through this kind of channel. Maybe it's because I am a curator and a writer. So for me, like all my ideas are second order ideas. The artists make the first idea and I'm the person who has the luxury of coming along and thinking about it and commenting on it. So I've been running an interview series called Design in Dialogue since the pandemic began, trying to kind of keep these conversations going. And so that's like a weekly check-in with amazing brains. And, in the time between, I think about what they're up to and prepare myself. And then you do that deep dive. And I mean, what's more inspiring than the inside of another person's head? So that's what it's been for me.
I've been watching something called Conrad Washman's Television, and Conrad Washman was a visionary architect who felt that the future of architecture was television, which I guess brings us back to this interface that we're communicating with today. And it's hosted by an architectural curator and theorist, Mark Wigley, who just published a really amazing. It's kind of like an investigation, almost like a whodunit, that goes through Washman's archive. It's on a website called Space Time TV.
Space Time TV. Okay. And V?
Like, like I'm inspired by, it's going to be weird, again, just off the cuff, like freestyle. Like, I've never watched more news in my life than in 2020, right? Like, when times were chill, characters like us would just be about our practice. Like, what project, not chill in quotes or whatever. Like, we're going to travel here. I'm going to go to do a show. I'm going to link up friends. I got a show in January in Paris. I got to go to Tokyo. Like, the global news was just sort of like backdrop, I thought that was something my parents watched as a kid,
right.
Like, that's the news. But 2020 is the year where you can't, like, hollowed spaces can't ignore global politics or can't ignore the pandemic. Like, we definitely could have, when times were good, those spaces were so disconnected from the reality of the world in a way. And so in short, just like watching the news, understanding how polarized the world is, and not being on the internet where you follow people that probably have similar likes to yourself and similar interests. So you start thinking that the world is a bit more utopian than it really is, and the news is just a bit of like a top tier logic and conversation. I'm inspired by how cultural moves along, and that like is where a lot of my ideas stem from, is like observation then execution.
Right. I feel all of that. I mean, I also feel like because of my job, I've had to move in spaces and being able to see certain things. I think the word of 2020 for me was perspective. I think my perspective has fully changed from all of that, from being a person who now watches the news more than I ever have, or, just interacting with different people in different ways has definitely been a wild one. But I want to thank you all for joining me today in this conversation about icons. It's been great. It's been fab. Did you guys have a good time?
It was great.
Great time. Thanks for having us.
It's just because I'm the best. We all know it. Yeah, we all know it. I think everyone who's watching on Sneakers Live learned a bit more about every single one of us, and also learned more about the 10 icons. Something's off. And also I think a message I'd like to give to everyone is to just I'm going to quote you, Glenn, here, because I thought it was a great thing. Go where you think you won't and do it with style. Right? We can all go with that. And I also want to say this book is available everywhere, but currently right now before the 22nd, it is available at a host of booksellers, especially Reparations Club and Arcana, who I love a lot. You can go onto, I think there's a notify me button. You can click that and find out where to get the book. It's available offwhite.com, Sneakers, and everywhere else January 22nd. My name's Shaniqua Jarvis, and I think this is over.
Peace.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all.